Born on December 16, 1775 in Hampshire, England, Jane Austen is undoubtedly one of the most loved authors of England's golden literary history. Time and place of birth centres her lifespan in one of Europe's most transformational periods. A citizen of the British Empire, her birth corresponds with the outbreak of the American War of Independence and latterly the French Revolution, both inspired by notions of individual liberty espoused through the ideas of the Enlightenment. Furthermore, there were the Napoleonic Wars that had the greatest effect on Austen's experience of British life in her adult years, and are the most clearly evident in her storylines. The significance of these historical events is evident in the fracturing of the rigid class structure that existed in Austen's time. It is worth detailing these class divisions given that it is a running theme throughout her narratives. At the top we find the aristocracy, the upper class that consisted of those holding hereditary titles. Dukes and duchesses, earls and viscounts, they tended to own vast estates and wield significant political power. Then we have the landed gentry, the landowners. The status of this social class varied widely depending on the amount of land owned and the fortune it brought. Again, much of this was inherited. Below this was the upper middle or professional class, those who owed their fortune to the exercise of their profession. As we shall see, it was this class that became a particular threat to the class structure, as the idea of the value of merit began to surpass the respect for birthright, and as their efforts rewarded them, they became more able to purchase land and compete with the upper class for status. The remaining lower middle class, working class and lower class find little room for mention in Austen. They would have to wait for the works of Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo to have the spotlight. For major novels ranging from 1811 until her untimely death in 1817, Austen achieved 4 publications: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park and Emma, whilst Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published posthumously in 1818. In these novels we have a view of life in Georgian England from the perspective of someone who is a member of a family at the lower echelons of the landed gentry, someone who has been impacted by transformational world events but has no direct experience of them. And what makes her so astoundingly brilliant is that she seems to sculpt her narrative so effortlessly, yet the message is so profoundly layered. And it is with reference to layers that we will examine Austen's work for the remainder of this video. I've chosen 5 layers in all: the narrative style, the social dynamic, the feminine perspective, moral development, and the historical context. Austen's narrative style itself is multidimensional. It is like a bridge that covers the gap left by the Gothic and Romantic genres of her era. Whilst these two genres diverged from one another in several ways, they were both a backlash against the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, science, and empirical investigation, in that they sought to bring to the surface the repressed desires of the imagination for the transcendent and the supernatural. In contrast, Austen was a social realist who used her writing to critique the social structure of the society she lived in. She is particularly praised for her use of free, indirect discourse, when the third-person narration seems to blend perfectly with the thoughts and emotions of the characters, giving the reader a more intimate insight into their mindset. It adds to the realism contained in her narrative, in that it is useful in exposing the flaws and misconceptions of her characters. Like in the case of Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, who spends much of the novel asleep inside a Gothic fantasy of intrigue and mystery, only to be awoken by the mundane reality that actually surrounds her. And this is also a theme that we see repeated in Austen's work, the juxtaposition of the rational against the emotional. For example, the characters of Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility. Eleanor is the embodiment of rationality and restraint, whilst Marianne is tortured by her unchecked emotions, like some unfortunate romantic heroine. In all of this, irony and satire were 2 of her most potent weapons. They enable Austen to critique the social order in a way that is realist, but avoids a burdensomely serious tone. Austen was living in the neoclassical Georgian Regency age of Britain, which coincided with the spread of Enlightenment ideas through Europe. It was a time when reason had torn down the god-appointed rulers from their thrones and had now become king in their place. It had shaken the foundations of the rigid class system that existed in Britain, and Austen recognises it. There is a sense of unease amongst the aristocracy that feature in her tales. For instance, the central story of Persuasion sees Lady Russell persuade Anne Elliot to reject the advances of Frederick Wentworth. because she is aristocracy while he is merely a naval officer. This snobbery and slavish attachment to class division is not in itself surprising, but it is flavoured with an anxiety toward the threat of a professional class that were earning wealth through individual merit. And when Anne Elliot encounters Captain Wentworth 8 years later, we see the manifestation of this anxiety. Wentworth has become exceedingly wealthy owing to his escapades in the Napoleonic Wars. Meanwhile, Wentworth is contrasted with the declining fortunes of Sir Walter Elliot, Anne's father, who Austen paints as a caricature of upper-class entitlement. He is a man who has inherited his wealth and social status, and seems intent on squandering it, oblivious to his own profligate indolence. When this eventually leads to the loss of the family residence at Kellynch Hall to no less than the naval family of Admiral and Mrs. Croft, Frederick Wentworth's sister, it is clear that Austen's use of irony is critiquing the downfall of the aristocracy into idle irrelevance to be overthrown by the more resourceful professional class. It should come as no surprise to us that Austen's work is valued for the feminine insight it provides to life in Britain in the early 19th century. The fact that her protagonists are all female should be an instant giveaway. But even apart from that, the number of female characters who play a significant role is distinctive in Austen. This is frequently captured with plots that are driven by the pressures that young women faced in finding a husband who could see to the provision of their livelihood. The iconic opening line of Pride and Prejudice is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife has more than a ring of irony to it. For the inverse of this truth was all the more applicable in Austen's time. Indeed, her own lifetime income is thought to have reached something in the region of a mere £600, and this was a feature of her time that made its way into every corner of her writing, the difficulty faced by women in providing for themselves without accepting a marriage proposal. And so we find Austen repeatedly developing storylines that emphasise the reliance her protagonists have on a strong female companion. For every Emma Woodhouse, there is a Harriet Smith, every Elizabeth Bennet has a Jane Bennet, and every Eleanor Dashwood has a Marianne Dashwood, just as Austen had her elder sister Cassandra. It is like she is exposing the covert organisation of women working beneath the male-dominated surface to navigate a path that will enable their survival. Although an appeal to realism is central to Austen's feminist approach, somewhat paradoxically we also see the seeds of romanticism beginning to sprout that will question the reign of reason. This is no more evident than when the theme of marriage is revisited throughout her work, and is presented not as some purely rational undertaking made for one's economic and social benefit, but as something accompanied by passion. Think of Elizabeth Bennet's initial rejection of the proposal of Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, events that echoed the life of Austen herself, who on the 2nd of December 1802, when she was just a few weeks from her 27th birthday, it appears she accepted the marriage proposal of 21-year-old long-time family acquaintance Harris Bigwither. Bigwither was in line to inherit a small fortune that would have provided much desired security for Austen. However, it seems that she was struck by the emptiness of this prospect of marrying for this reason alone, and retracted her acceptance the next morning. Austen has Elizabeth Bennet begin the story full of pride in her own wit and intellect, such as it allows her to form prejudices that are exposed in her rejection of Darcy. Rightly, she rejects the offer of security and comfort, but for the wrong reasons. However, it is qualities of intellect and wit that enable her self-reflection that promotes her moral growth. In the end, we find a character that is able to accept Darcy's proposal, not simply out of need, but out of admiration for his character and from a humbling of her own. As we noted at the beginning, with a lifespan stretching from the 16th of December 1775 until the 18th of July 1817, Austen lives through the Age of the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars, with all of these events having a significant impact on British society and the influence of Britain throughout the world. The evidence is impressed upon every page of Austen's work. However, she makes no explicit reference to any of them, and builds no storylines directly around them. Instead, Austen does what Austen does best, and develops characters, some who have been in direct contact with these events, and exposes how they have been shaped by their social circumstances. In this sense, characters like Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice and Captain Wentworth in Persuasion are manifestations of how worldwide events are impacting on British society. In Wickham's case, the fleeting presence of the military and its lack of respect for ethical norms. In Wentworth's, a man who went and made his worth and whose return upsets the social order. We also see the impact of the introduction of ideas of individual liberty and the elevation of reason. We see it mainly in the analysis of the social norms from the perspective of the female characters in Austen's books. This ability to question where to find dignity and justice is driven by the Enlightenment ideology that could be employed to establish not just the concept of the inherent worth of all men against a hierarchical social order as was drawn out in the American and French revolutions, but also the inherent worth of women against an irrational, patriarchal order. Even if Austen expresses this more through irony and satire than the Americans and the French ever did.